nature. So I think that's a good quote. And my next slide, ecofeminism emerged from the radical social movements, social justice movements of the 1960s and 70s. These are some of the movements that it emerged from. And again, it emerged from a desire to make the connections between and among, excuse me, various forms of oppression, and to create liberatory solutions that don't just reinforce power hierarchies. So ecofeminism was a challenge to the environmental movement for not including adequately women's issues or originally environmental justice issues. It challenged the peace movement. It kind of came out of and in response to and in dialogue with all these other social movements that were happening at the time. So ecofeminism is against all these bad things that non-ecofeminist liberation and social justice movements fought and fight against. So you can note that there's a wide range here, and I enjoyed putting this list together. Everything from ecofeminism is against racism, from racism to patriarchal religion, right? Because when God is man, man is God, as Mary Daly, I think, said. Against war, against phallocratic rationality. Notice rationality in quotes there. So the binary oppositions between man and nature, thought and feeling, north and south, whatever it is. Against animal abuse, the abuse of animals, the abuse of people, nuclear weapons, the abuse of ecosystems, etc. Okay. But ecofeminism is also for a lot of things. They're not just against the bad things. Ecofeminists have articulated their positive values and vision and generated their own kind of internally contested culture or cultures over the decades of activism and scholarship. I want to point out, not every ecofeminist would agree with all of these things, but these are all things that you will find ecofeminists have written about, talked about, been active against, active for politically. And again, you'll see a wide range because the perspective of ecofeminism is very integrated. It's very much about building the connections and seeing the interdependencies between different forms of oppression and different forms of liberation. So there's no contradiction between a queer environmentalism for sexual diversity and being dedicated to sustainability and regeneration for future generations and for our own generation. So there's no conflict between these inherently. Although, again, there are ecofeminists who will have will have their own opinions, and that is as it should be. Everybody has their own opinion. Okay, I'm gonna give you, I'm just gonna check my time. Okay, of course, I'm like running way behind. So I am just gonna skip over some of these people. Petra Kelly, founder of the Green Party. Vandana Shiva, who's a food sovereignty, among other things, activist. Inestra King, these are just some major figures, not just. And I'm going to get to the Declaration of Interdependence by We Do, which is the Women Development and the Environment organization, which was a really important space for ecofeminist organizing and ideas. Founded in 1990 to orchestrate a women's voice within the UN. And in this Declaration of Interdependence, there are all kinds of things like expose the connections between environmental degradation, uncontrolled militarism, and technology devoid of human values. And we insist that human and ecological values take absolute precedence when decisions are made in national affairs. There's a whole, platform there. Is ecofeminist activism relevant today? Well, I think there are many resonances for ecofeminism. This picture from 2017 shows some demonstrators in Chile. They're opposing AITPP, which is an international agricultural trade treaty, which would have been exploitive to workers, farmers, and to the planet, bad for the ecosystems. Alto Maipo, Chile's struggle against the mining industry for the right to water, because that was a big hydroelectrical project. And then I also want to talk about, I mean, these are my 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 issues that I'm just going to mention as, you know, there are so many, these are some of the many issues that an ecofeminist perspective can inform, can help raise generative questions about, and could contribute to sustainable solutions. Because that's part of what ecofeminism brings to the table, is saying we're not going to achieve environmental justice at the expense of you know, women or farmers, or, you know, we're not going to control COVID-19, but at the expense of, you know, everybody who's a domestic worker, or, you know, just all different ways to, there are so many ways to look at these various issues with an ecofeminist perspective, bringing it all together, trying to create something that is actually sustainable, that's actually just, and that can work for women, work for people, work for plants, animals, the environment, because just as the ecofeminists said in the 1970s, in the 1980s, we are living, and perhaps, probably, certainly even more so now, we're living on the precipice, right? We're racing towards all different kinds of environmental and human catastrophes, and some of them are already occurring with global climate crisis, the, you know, the destruction of the watersheds, you know, all different kinds of things. And we really need to put these issues, as we all know, everybody on this call knows, we have to put them front and center. But we can do it in an ecofeminism says we can do it in an intersectional way that doesn't just replicate existing hierarchies of power, exploitation, and oppression. So I'm going to close with a quote from Starhawk, who was a significant ecofeminist and who's still doing social justice work. When we bring people care and earth care together with an eye to future generations, we create a synergy that has immense power for healing and regeneration. I really like that quote. She doesn't look like this anymore, but I think it's a beautiful picture. She still looks beautiful. And I am going to leave you with that quote from Starhawk, which I think captures a lot about ecofeminism. So thank you very much. Wait, I'm trying to stop my screen share, and it's not working. There we go. Okay, back to you. Thank you.
Banu, you need to unmute.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So again, let me add my thanks to Stacy and the other organizers for inviting me, and I'm really honored to be with this wonderful panel and look forward to our discussions. So time, place, the scale of time and place, who we are, who we were, who we will become. It is all about memory, remembering. As Toni Morrison argues, you know, they straightened out the Mississippi River in places to make room for and livable acreage. Occasionally, the river floods these places. Floods is the word they use. But in fact, it is not flooding. It is remembering. Remembering where it used to be. All water has perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it was. It is emotional memory, what the nerves and the skin remember, as well as how it appeared. And a rush of imagination is our flooding. Imagination it is, as migrants the world over have noted, we live with a potent emotional memory, some true, some false, some fiction. Home, once interrogated, Kamala Vishveshwar notes, is a place we have never been before. So how do we tell the story of our planet? A story of a once conjoined planet of Pangaea that drifted away into continents, Laurasia, Gondwana land, moving, breaking up, moving, millions of years, still moving until they reconnect in a new Pangaea in the future. Species separated at birth will reconnect again hundreds of millions of years later. Will they still be the same species? Will they biologically recognize each other? Across these vast timescapes and mobile spacescapes, who belongs where? Who are kith and kin in this new land? How do we tell a story of belonging, unbelonging, and rebelonging? This is fundamentally a story of violence. In the history of years that have elapsed and through the histories of conquest, colonialism, and slavery, a teeming inventive life on Earth has been decimated, cleaved into hierarchies of human and non-human, superior and inferior, master and slave, native and alien, colonizer and colonized. We have rendered a vital, vibrant planet into desolate landscapes of cracked and crushed Earth, an ecological apocalypse of pillaged lands and peoples through slavery and empire. A feminist retelling of the story highlights not an abstract Anthropocene, but a sexually and racially stratified anthropos. Indeed, some anthropos colonized, conquered, and enslaved and dehumanized other anthropos. Then they returned home with their rich spoils to build fortresses and enact borders and boundaries and laws to keep and protect their stolen fortunes. Let us see theory in action. Consider the field of invasion biology, a recent subfield emerging only in the 1980s. By their very definition, invasive species must be foreign. In the last few decades, the field of invasion biology has exploded. A frenzy of xenophobic alarm by groups from the political right and left, from environmentalists and non-environmentalists alike, have spawned a veritable industry of bioinvasion, an entire academic, policy-oriented, and activist field. The idea of invasion biology is predicated on a view of nature in place and nature out of place. This growing international interest in the field has stoked alarm of a world increasingly out of place. Cultural theorists argue that this recent hyperbole of alien species is similar to germ panics of the past and is best understood as a cultural panic about changing racial, economic, and gender norms in the nation. The perceived globalization of markets and the real and perceived lack of local control feed nationalist discourse. Immigrants and foreigners, products of the global, are perceived as one of the key reasons for problems in the local. And indeed, in our times, we see this every day in the newspapers. Thinking of invasion biology to the histories of empire is enlightening because it reveals a profound botanical amnesia. Our theories of nature often do not consider the histories of empire in shaping the biogeography of non-human entities in the world. Yet empire is as central to non-human worlds as human worlds. Where humans went, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, and viruses went. What if we refuse the binaries of nature, culture, and rethink empire through nature cultures, and trace the shared histories of colonial migration? Indeed, environmental historians argue that imperialism is fundamentally an ecological project in which humans, plants, and other species were shuffled across the earth in schemes for colonization and conquest. In the early modern period, botany was big science and big business, critical to Europe's ambition as a colonial trader. Colonialism ushered a massive and grand reshuffling of global biota. Indeed, it would be accurate to characterize colonial expansion as the original bioinvasion. one can and should understand the botanical sciences as a significant legacy in the afterlives of empire. In the context of the history of empire, the rise of discourses of invasive species is particularly ironic. As colonialism ushered in new landscapes of empire and new formations of nature cultures, nativist thinking re-engaged with national borders. Discourses of invasive species remains a prominent feature of the environmental afterlives of empire, as waves of nationalisms consume post-colonial worlds and post-colonial nations move to secure their borders. It is an ultimate act of irony that after centuries of global expansion and ecological decimation of the planet, those very nations now insist on preserving the new Europes, the new Americas from Asia, South America, and Africa. Tracking the histories of invasive rhetoric allows us to understand how plant and animal quarantine laws developed alongside national exclusion acts. Indeed, in the poignant cases of settler colonialism, national rewriting of history reimagines the white settlers as the new natives that now relegate all others as foreign and undesirable. This is no pristine Eden here, no purity, no corner untouched by colonialism and its afterlives and the rapacious tentacles of modernity. Indeed, while the powerful have only now discovered an impending apocalypse, the colonized have long lived through apocalyptic nightmares of settler and neo-colonialisms. I re-narrate these abbreviated history to highlight both the hubris of empire and its subsequent amnesia that together prevent us from a true botanical reckoning of our colonial past. Invasion biology is entirely a project of colonial nostalgia and return. A true biological reckoning must acknowledge that we are all migrants now, all refugees of a ravaged nature cultural past, seeking to salvage our nature cultural present and futures. The constructions of native, aliens, migrants, and refugees are all political constructions of the unequal lives of empire. The ravages of empire have transformed not only human and cultural landscapes, but also ecological ones. So no species is well adapted anymore. We are all displaced, no longer living in the worlds we grew up in. Our environments no longer familiar. We are all refugees, albeit in very unequal and hierarchical worlds. The rise of the global right bespeaks a global anxiety about place. But rather than focusing on nativism, thinking in and out of empire reminds us that we are all adapted to worlds that no longer exist at home. Indeed, the world that might feel like home might be thousands of miles away on another continent. Reckoning with the false boundaries and borders of nations and nationalisms are not only about human worlds, but increasingly also about our co-inhabitants of the planet, the plants that feed us, the fabrics that clothe us, and the lumber that houses us. We need new nature cultural imaginations for our rural lives. But for that, we need to reckon with the botanical amnesia that consumes us. Thank you.
I guess I'm up. So thank you again, echo all the thanks. Amy and Heidi, it's really nice to meet you and be in conversation. And of course, I feel starstruck because this is the first time I've ever been on a panel with Banu, and I've been teaching and learning of her work for many years. So this is such a privilege. And I just want to give a shout out to all the folks from Wellesley. I see some of my students, Aya and Rachel. Thanks for joining today. So what I'm going to be focusing on is one main question. So what counts as the environment in epigenetics? And as Stacey introduced at the beginning, I look at clinical trials, pregnancy trials in particular, that draw from epigenetics. And I can kind of get into that as we move on. And the picture below is by Joanna Underhill, and it's actually a painting of her experience of cancer. And I include it because it's beautiful, but also it reminds me of how a lot of the fundamental research within epigenetics started in cancer research. So what is epigenetics? And I'll go really quickly, but I'm a stickler for defining my terms. So gene-environment interaction, regulation, expression, it's a shift away from genetic determinism, and it's nonlinear transgenerational inheritance. So these are very character-defining aspects of the field. But one of the aspects that I'll focus on is how it has changed understandings of the environment. So, capaciously understood, the environment can include anything from exposure inside the body, like cells, organs, and the microbiome, as well as exposure from outside the body, including the natural built environment. Epigenetics emphasizes that the environment occurs on different scales, from the cellular all the way up to or out to the atmospheric. And environments in epigenetics are also temporal contexts. So temporality is also an entangled aspect of the environment. And so in this kind of rough illustration, you can kind of get a sense that there are a lot of different environmental factors that become important in epigenetics. And this illustration is one of the ones that is pretty capacious and open and all-inclusive. However, in my research on the clinical translation of epigenetics in pregnant populations, I found that in translating epigenetic ideas from animal and insect models to human models, there is a huge or a significant methodological and ideological challenge to studying the environment in capacious and entangled ways. For instance, different approaches to epigenetics will focus on distinct areas of the environment. So, for instance, the area of neuroscience, looking at brain plasticity, the environment may include daily experiences. In environmental health agencies, the environment may be pesticides, air pollution. In maternal health and pregnancy trials that I look at, the environment is mainly determined or defined as pregnant bodies and behaviors. So the various ways that environmental targets are rendered visible and intervenable in the application of epigenetics also creates certain forms of responsibility and not others. And I'll return to this point at the end. So just to give you an idea, epigenetic environments in pregnancy trials, a huge focus, and these are the terms that they use, is the maternal metabolic environment. So that's a huge focus on food, what pregnant people eat, how much they exercise, how their body breaks down the nutrients, and all of this is framed as influencing fetal development. Another term that is used is the intrauterine or fetal development, which provides kind of ownership or foregrounds the fetus and has its own issues as well. So these are the kinds of languages that come to animate the environment in my field sites. So the pregnancy trials that I look at draw from epigenetics to justify or to make this claim, which is that a pregnant person's diet and weight can affect the health of her unborn child and genetic development of future generations. And so it is assumed, and again, a lot of the gender terminologies are used within my field site. So I go back and forth between what the scientists refer to and what I would refer to it from my perspective. So within the domain of this research, the mother is considered the first generation, the fetus the second, reproductive cells in the fetus are the third. So in this way, whatever the maternal environment does or inhabits can influence future generations. And this is translated in the trials that I look at to mean that whatever pregnant people eat, the fetus eats, and then that could potentially predispose future generations to obesity and diabetes. So this is how these ideas about the environment get animated in clinical trials. Next, I'll turn to a story about honeybees, and mainly because I love honeybees, but it also is a really good illustration of epigenetics and interpretations of epigenetics, and it kind of comes from this multi-species approach, which is that across species, there are ideologies that persist. Okay, so the story goes like this. Honeybees, all honeybees, come from the same genetic material, so that all the larvae are genetically identical. However, something happens during early development that genetically distinguishes between queen bees and worker bees. Again, this is the language of the scientists. So two different insects emerge from the same DNA. Two phenotypically different insects emerge. The queen bee is much larger in comparison to the worker bee, and more significantly, the queen bee is fertile, whereas the worker bee is sterile. Okay, so this phenomenon is studied within molecular biology, molecular genetics, and the scientists found that food or nutrition can stimulate epigenetic changes. The larvae that are fed royal jelly develop into fertile queen bees, and the larvae that are not fed royal jelly develop into sterile worker bees. Okay, so in the words of the scientists, they write, fertile queens and sterile workers develop from genetically identical larvae following differential feeding with royal jelly. Young nurse bees in the hive produce and feed royal jelly to larvae destined to become queens, whereas the other larvae are fed with less sophisticated food. Okay. And this is just great material, and from a feminist perspective of how language really matters and how we think about language and how language shapes our social worlds and how we inhabit them. There are a lot of feminists that do this, and one of my favorites is Emily Martin. So an homage to Emily Martin, I will kind of think about this language a little bit deeper. So one aspect that stands out from this description is that the authors characterize the nurse bees as the only individuals responsible for producing and providing nutrients to developing larvae. By focusing on the individual role of nurse bees, attention is displaced from larger aspects of honeybee behavior and environment. So we know that honeybees live and behave collectively. The process of nurturing and providing nutrients does not depend solely on the nurse bee. There is a whole food production process that is missing from the scientist's description. The only way that the nurse bees can produce royal jelly is if they have pollen. Worker bees are responsible for collecting pollen and feeding it to the nurse bees that then feed it to the larvae. In addition, unfortunately, honeybees around the globe are experiencing significant environmental stress, which is causing worker bees to randomly, and sometimes they're forced to abandon their hives, leaving the rest of the colony to starve to death. The point I want to emphasize is that it is not an individual nurse bee who is responsible for the destiny of the queen bee. The relationship between nurses and bees that produce royal jelly and pregnant bodies is that both the honeybees and pregnant people, epigenetic science is used to explain only a fraction of the story between genes and environmental interactions. Both illustrations reflect how ideologies of individualism and essentialized framings of reproduction are enveloped into scientific interpretations of epigenetics. In the honeybees, the emphasis is on the food, royal jelly, and likewise in the clinical trials, food or nutrition in the form of calories becomes the main focus. But how the collective life of the hive affects the larval feeding process and how pregnant people access quality food or housing disappears from view. Despite epigenetic knowledge of how vulnerable and malleable genetic expression can be, and despite the multiple scales that can be rendered as environmental within epigenetics, the studies that I examine use epigenetics to target individual pregnant bodies for intervention. A capacious understanding of epigenetics shows us that stress, social inequalities, racism, trauma can get into our cells and bodies. Yet, selective interpretations and translations of these ideas are narrowed down to align with existing social and political climates characterized by settler-late liberalism and capitalism. How we define the environment is a social and political project that still requires feminist vigilance. Instead of investing hundreds of millions of dollars into research that focuses on changing individual bodies in order to make them resilient to toxic racist environments, we should shift focus on how to change racist environments. From a feminist and critical race framework, the key question is, what kinds of environments promote healthy, safe bodies? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Just thank you so much. I really am enjoying listening to all of your presentations. And so I'm like nodding, yes, yes, yes. I teach some of it, but in different ways. And it's really, really helpful and interesting. So my work is a little bit different. I shifted, just quickly to give you a little background about what I'm doing. I shifted from doing kind of traditional academic work to being more of a public scholar. And so I'm in the process actually of making a documentary about the 3 Mile Island nuclear meltdown that took place in 1979. I'm going to show you a little bit of that trailer. And so I actually shifted out of doing my degree was originally in English, but I always did race and gender in literature. Then I moved forward to the contemporary period. I had cancer, my mother had cancer, my father had cancer, and they passed away, and then I got cancer very quickly after, and it shifted my my thinking about the urgency of what was important to work on. And so I started to teach ecofeminism. That was my entry, and I was more generalized, and I did a lot of all those, not to say that you're all generalized, but I used different pieces of things you guys are doing. And I still teach that course, but I got further and further drawn into a story, which I'll quickly tell you and then show the trailer. I was teaching this class on ecofeminism, and it was a big hit with my students. This is about 12, I don't know how many years ago, but right after I got tenure, I was an 18th century scholar. I was like, okay, now I can teach a course that's different, that's out of my traditional field, and that I was hired for, and students loved it. And then a member of my family told me a story about my mom, which I'd never heard, which was that she was a part of something called Women's Strike for Peace. And I'd never heard of that. And Women's Strike for Peace was a group of women in the early 1960s, and they worked to stop atmospheric bomb testing. And a treaty was signed because of their work by the UK, the USSR, and the US. So I was really struck by this story. I was struck, one, why my mother had never told me this, now she was passed away, why this is an important moment in history, right? That it never mentioned in my family. My parents were activists, but gee, my mom's work, which was so significant, not talked about. And then I sort of fell into a nuclear rabbit hole. That raised all kinds of feminist questions for me. Number one, I'd studied women's studies, I was teaching ecofeminism, and I never came across the story. And then in my own family, I never came across the story. So it seemed to play into this kind of silencing and denial of a really important part of our history. And that this intersection of a woman's story personally, but also a woman's bigger story, and also activism and ecological devastation and health issues and impacts on women and children, completely denied and silenced. And that pattern, that structure, I dove into, and to try and understand, well, what was Women's Strike for Peace, and what were all the sort of other things that are surrounding that? And that has become really my life's work. So my bio should be added. It's a little bit of an old bio, which is fine, that I write a lot and primarily about women and nukes. That's my thing, and I have lots of chapters out. I'm working on a book on that, and this film is sort of that. And so I spend my time going to communities, disaster communities, interviewing many, many people, primarily women, and hearing their stories. And so I've done this with Fukushima, I've done this at 3 Mile Island, I've done this at Rocky Flats, which is a nuclear facility in Colorado, and other places. And over, what's amazing is you hear very, very similar stories. You hear women saying, usually it's the women, of course men too, but predominantly it's groups of women and mothers who become really concerned about the potential health concerns. They takes over their lives. These are not only like ordinary women. I hate to use that term, but I mean, these are not academics per se, or medical professionals or scientists. They're women who are homemakers, pretty traditional often, which radically change their lives and become activists out of this concern. And then the other pattern is that their concerns are belittled, they're treated like, you know, little lady, pat them on the head by the scientists, by the male figures in authority who typically, the history of nuclear technology is that it's designed, implemented, and all of the policy is sort of male dominated and white male dominated. And of course that's changing slowly as the world changes, but very slowly. And so you'll see this kind of dynamic over and over again in these communities of mothers saying, we feel there's a problem. We're seeing higher cancer rates in our community. We're concerned about our health, about our children's health. And these sort of white male figures saying, you just don't understand enough. You don't have the education. You can't possibly understand. And one of the terms that's come up is actually an invented term called radiophobia, which is used as if it's a real medical term. And if we don't have the time today to go into it, but if you take that term apart, it actually is completely illogical and makes no sense in terms of being sort of a scientific diagnosis. But that term, I was kind of looking around on the web earlier, there are sites that actually reify this idea of what radiophobia is in a very kind of misogynist framework. So the term came up as a way to describe women's fears about radiation disasters post-World War II. And it was a way to kind of dispel, well, to quiet, to say, you know, they're just hysterical. I mean, there's no real harm here. We shouldn't, you know, there's harm in great disasters, but they're you know, they're very fearful about the potential of war, you know, the potential of exposures to nuclear weapons. And it was a way of really sort of belittling the concern of women in their communities and the health of their children. And so that term kind of really signifies, or you know, really signifies what's going on that I look at, which is, you know, why are these women's stories silenced, how they're silenced, and how that keeps us from investigating what really happens in a community, what has happened to people's bodies, what is the impact of radiation on that community, why these stories, why these disaster stories are silenced, and they are. I mean, I could name, you know, if I asked you, do you know who Alice Stewart is, or do you know who Lise Meitner is, or Helen Caldicott, or Petra Kelly, or Rosalie Bertell, you might know Karen Silkwood because of the Hollywood movie, but we won't know these names. We won't know what Women Strike for Peace is. And so what's the cost of that not knowing? I'm talking really fast because I have so much I always want to share with you. I think I have a little time to show the film clip. It's just a short, and oh wait, I have to share, hang on. The share screen. There we go. Share screen. Do you see it though? Do you see it? Great.
You could see the towers from our kitchen window, but I had absolutely no idea what nuclear power was. You have this accident that you can't see it, smell it, taste it, feel it, or know anything about it. And my husband had metallic taste when he came back. And I said, don't worry about that. It can't be radiation.
To assure the people of this region that everything possible is being done and will be done to cope with these problems, both at the reactor and in the contingency planning for all eventualities that might occur.
So I'm just going to turn the sound, and so that is Helen Caldicott, who's an interesting figure in nuclear history. So what I have been finding in my work is there's this kind of key things that are happening. One is this sort of denial. There's terminology like radiophobia, which is a kind of silencing. And there's an erasure. And it's not, it's been often, in terms of public discourse, it's been white women who've been these voices. But it is obviously a very intersectional issue. One key issue is, where does the uranium come from? And the uranium is mined largely in indigenous communities like the Navajo, like Nigerians in Africa, like Aborigine lands in Australia, and those are also silenced. There are important stories of erasure there, where there's been no public access to it, other than some scholars have gone in, but you don't see it in the public discourse. For instance, in the 2 nuclear reactors now that are being built, major funds going into the building of them. Who's paying for them? Poor Black communities in Georgia. Their bills, their electric bills it's an added payment that goes on to build those, and we don't hear that discourse. And so there's a lot around environmental injustice that kind of gets sublimated and erased in these stories. And there's a very powerful intersectional history. Part of the civil rights movement was working with women from Women's Strike for Peace. So there's a lot, and through that erasure, of course, you're erasing those relationships and the potential for building those relationships going forward. And I think that's really relevant today. I'm going to close with this point, which is I hosted something on Tuesday in this seminar that I'm leading, and we had Gina Belafonte and Sister Ardeth Plate, who's 2 people who've been involved, whose families and who have been involved with anti-nuclear work for years. These sisters, and they're part of the Plowshares movement, they protest, they put their bodies on the line, they go to jail over and over in prison. And then we have the really interesting story of Gina Belafonte. Her father, Harry Belafonte, was a very big movie star in the 60s and 70s. Some of you may know him still. And he was a very active civil rights activist, but part of his work was also anti-nuclear, very outspoken. And so we talked about that intersectionality. And there's a really powerful metaphor in there too, which is in a post-apocalyptic period that right after World War II, and everyone's really sort of hyper aware of the potential for nuclear war, there are all these films come out, and there's a sort of an obsession with the womb. And I think this ties into what you're talking about, Natali, with the womb, with things like epigenetics, what will happen to the babies coming forward. But simultaneously, there's a concern about reproducing white babies. And you see this in the films of that time period. So there's a lot here, I think, that all of us are talking about where we have overlap. And I will close with that, and just thank you so much for inviting me and for hosting this event. And I'm looking forward to our conversation as we continue. I think I stuck within the 10 minutes. I hope.
Thank you all so much for those presentations, Heidi, your video, and really just all of the research and expertise that you're bringing. At this point, we want to open up the webinar for any questions that we have, and we have some that are in the question box, but I know also sometimes folks feel better about framing their question verbally, so if you want to ask a verbal question, then you're more than welcome to just type in the chat box that you have a question, and then one of our co-hosts, graduate student organizers, will unmute you so that you can verbally frame your question to the audience or to the speakers. But one of the first questions that we got when y'all were speaking, and this is definitely for all the panelists, are what are good sources to keep an eye on for new research in ecofeminism? And anybody can take it.
I'll speak to that a little bit. I don't have a good answer. I think that ecofeminists today are not necessarily working as ecofeminists as such, and you find their work in all different kinds of fields, and also people have different feelings about the term ecofeminism. So some people will say, well, And that's always been the case. So I think that it's a little bit tricky, and you kind of have to look for it, but you know, it's being done. There's a lot that's being done that is, if not ecofeminist in name, at least ecofeminist in the perspective, as I understand it and as it's been defined, and what other people think.
I also would like to add, I mean, one of the things that I do, I follow women environmentalists who are active. And they, again, might not call them, like Amy's saying, they might not call themselves ecofeminists, but they're doing work where they're certainly paying attention to gender issues and to racial issues. And the other thing is there's an organization, if you're in the humanities, called ASLE, A-S-L-E, American Society for Literature and the Environment. They do a very good job of listing new publications, and there's a lot of people there doing ecofeminist work. And one of the key people is Greta Gard. She's someone to follow. She's always publishing on ecofeminism. But I think for me, there's like I don't just work in the academic space. I work a lot in the activist space. So like something like WIDO you mentioned, there's other organizations. There are women anti-nuclear groups, WAND, which is specifically about gender and nukes. So, but you know, those are my interests. But I think within the activist world, there's a ton of organizations and people specifically who one can follow and learn so much from, and they're writing and they're publishing and so on.
I might just add another reference, but it's not necessarily explicitly tied to the term ecofeminism. But one of the areas that informs a lot of my analysis is material feminisms. And one of the great helpful texts, and this is probably for a graduate student audience, is Material Feminisms by Stacey Alamo and Susan Heckman. So there's this kind of, and there's also an edited volume on different intersectional approaches to different kinds of material feminisms. So older, or what we would imagine as Marxist materialists, and a kind of current late iteration of materialism as such. So those are two other kinds of threads that may be relevant to folks interested in the area.
If anyone's interested, I have on my website, HeidiHettner.com, I have a listing of readings on ecofeminism, and I need some updating, but if for undergraduates, you might be interested in looking at that. I'm sure everyone here on their websites has similar kinds of things, but that's a good, I have like literally reading lists on different environmental topics, and one of them is ecofeminism, so that might be helpful.
Thank you, everyone. The next question is, could you talk a little bit more about how the gender binary and gender nonconformity and transness fit into ecofeminism?
That's a good question too. I'll just start by saying, and I'm not going to go into depth on it, but I would say, because I would not say I'm the world's expert on that question, but I would say that I think Val Plummer, her whole concept of breaking down binaries is implicit to ecofeminism. It's all about doing away with hierarchy, doing away with binaries. So it seems to me there's, and Greta Gard writes about this as well, I think there's so much space for complicating that question, for addressing that question with ecofeminism, and it's ripe for people to do more work within it. And I think Alice Walker implicitly deals with it. For instance, in her, I'm forgetting the title, but in her sequel to The Color Purple, which a lot of people don't read, The Secret of Possessing Joy, she breaks down binaries between human and animal, between human and plant, and sexual desire and pleasure. And so not necessarily so much with identity, but I think she peeks into that, and in multiple places, even in Color Purple, and her essays about Color Purple. But I think that non-binary question is like, it's built in to this, to the kind of the theoretical framework of what ecofeminism is.
I think it's a great question, and I think it's at the heart of what we're talking about. So if you do a search, for example, for queer ecologies, there's been a lot written about, you know, just the normative understandings of ecology, of feminism, and, you know, often how racialized these categories are as well. So there's a lot out there. If you did a search on queer ecologies and queer biology, you will find. But I think it's at the heart of what we are talking about. So it's a great question.
Great. Amy and now if you don't have anything to add, I can just move on to another question. All right, great. So I just scrolled by it. Here it is. So this question asks, do you all see yourselves as working on feminist environmentalisms generally or ecofeminism more specifically? It goes on to explain that many feel that ecofeminism carries too much baggage and should be abandoned, and asking, should the term itself be defended? And the person goes on to clarify that they personally use some ecofeminist theory, but are just kind of interested in other people's perspectives.
I'll jump in. I was hoping this would come up. I mean, as somebody who has a long history with this topic, I think that, you know, there's an excellent book called Ecofeminist Natures that came out in 1997 by Noelle Sturgeon. And she really gets her hands dirty in this question of what is it about ecofeminisms that became so objectionable to other kinds of feminism. And basically, I mean, what I take from it is that we really have to be careful with when we typologize feminism. Or, you know, I'll just stick with feminism. You know, and we often get into this kind of circular firing squad, you know, on the left, where people are saying, you know, it's one thing to critique other feminist tactics and viewpoints, and we need that critique. We need all those critiques. But it's another thing to kind of, I think we fall into the trap of kind of focusing excessively on minute differences, as if other feminists are the people who are really a threat to our existence. So I think, you know, there absolutely are essentialist strands within ecofeminism. There are also absolutely anti-essentialist strands, and sometimes it's the same person. Sometimes at the same time, sometimes it's the same person, you know, at different times. And I think just one other thing I'll say about that is a lot of what has become seen as just true about ecofeminism being essentialist is not true. A lot of it is interested, it comes from a history of kind of different, you know, different strands and their internal conflicts. And it's also really important, and this also comes from Noelle Sturgeon, to look at the activist context in which these kind of strategic essentialisms are being constructed, right? So social movements need to construct essentialist identities to some extent in order to overcome particular obstacles that they're facing at the time. So, you know, women, mothers, you know, it's not that these are necessarily the identities that are at the core of what people are doing, but they're strategic essentialisms. I could say much more, obviously, but it's my 2 cents.
Can I just add that feminism is now such a capacious, huge, boundaryless, borderless space that I think it's not worth spending our time policing these boundaries, which, you know, which a lot of feminists do. But I think there are very real disagreements of why some don't agree with others, and understanding that complexity is really important for all of us. Why, you know, why So someone had a question about indigeneity and ecofeminism, right? And one would say that that should be central to any environmental feminism or any ecofeminism, because at least I think colonialism is so central to why the natural world is the way it is. But people study things from so many disciplinary and interdisciplinary vantage points that not everyone is looking at questions of indigeneity, right? So, so lots of things should be central, but given how specialized knowledge has become, that often we don't all address everything in our work. So I would echo what Amy is saying, is that we should be capacious in our word searches and our literature searches, because this work is everywhere. And it is important for us to be critical of each other, because that is how we grow, how our scholarship becomes important. But as feminists, hopefully we can do it respectfully in terms of strengthening the field rather than name calling.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, Banu and Amy. I want to just add to that, that one of the things I've struggled with is this essentialism problem, because, you know, as someone who is a cancer survivor, as someone who watched my parents die, really horrific deaths from cancer, and as someone who looks at high cancer rates, I have a really hard time like not thinking there's really a body there. I had the body, I had the, you know, the chemo running through my veins. Like, it's not something you forget. And when I look at like what numbers, you know, you look at numbers of what are the impacts of these things. And we know that cancer rates are skyrocketing, and, you know, 1 in 2 men will get cancer in their lifetimes. 1 in 3 women, childhood cancer rates didn't exist before World War II. We know this is coming from an industrial culture, both, you know, radiation, chemicals, synthetic chemicals, the petrochemical world. So it's like this tricky thing, right? We don't want to essentialize on the one hand, but we also have to deal with the essential facts that we live with, which our bodies are being invaded by harmful pollutants. And so, you know, for instance, 1 in 2, if a woman is twice as likely to get cancer from the same exposure to radiation as men, as an adult male. A girl child is 7 times or more likely to get cancer and die from the same exposure. Boys 5 times, and of course more so for children as they're younger. But safety regulations are based on an adult male body. Those are essential facts, but those are realities, and we do want to readjust what's considered safe according to our weakest bodies, which are in terms of radiation. I don't mean weak in other ways, but, you know, the younger the girl is, the more vulnerable she is.
Well,
and
I don't see that as essentializing. I mean, we're embodied creatures, right? We are part of nature. It's not like there's us and then there's the environment outside of us. I mean, although those categories can be very useful, as Natali is showing, I mean, that's all these categories. I think we just have to be mindful of what we're using them for. If we're using them in a way that's liberatory, that is towards greater human and life, you know, freedom and survival, and, you know, whatever our values are, then use the categories. But it's not wrong to say that we have bodies and that our bodies are affected by nature and that cancer is real. I don't think anybody could say that, oh, you shouldn't talk about that because that's essentialist. I mean, that's my take.
Yeah, I think we can, go ahead, Natali.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for the comments. And I have to echo Banu's point on the boundaries that get kind of created in terminology. And sometimes they are pretty contingent on the position that you get indoctrinated into, schools, regions, etc. So just in terms of categories, the reason I brought that up in the presentation in terms of like epigenetics has the potential to show us a capacious understanding of the environment, and the ways it gets translated become reduced to align with like ideologies that persist, particularly around late liberalism and capitalism. So in saying that these categories get mobilized in very familiar ways that continue oppressive systems, that is the area of like feminist inquiry. And that's kind of what it would be good to like, that's how I would practice the kind of analysis that I'm doing, is to showing, kind of doing. The names and the concepts could come from lots of different places, and in reflection, I probably have drawn from many different kinds of feminisms, not necessarily explicitly one-termed ecofeminism, but there are a lot of different kinds of materials that shape my thinking and ideas. And I guess it's up to me as an author to kind of like show the reader where I've come from in like how I'm thinking and situate myself ultimately, as Donna Haraway has taught us, is like situating our knowledge, situating ourselves to be able to allow a way of translating across these somewhat incommensurable differences in language and positions of being. Thank you.
Just to add to what Natali is saying, it's and what Amy said earlier about embodiment versus essentialism, and at least within feminist science studies, we've, I think, come to, and with all the work in genetics, we've come to such a different place in how we understand how bodies are constructed. So now we no longer see this, oh, this is social, this is biological, right? We understand that bodies are made through a process, and that's precisely Natali's work is showing, is made through. You need both of them. Genes don't just express themselves, they express themselves within context. So, I mean, I wish we would, I agree with Natali that we need more words. Sometimes these words have such histories and immediately get typecast. But I think as a field, we've moved to a place where we can demonstrate and show, how embodiment happens and how bodies function.
Wonderful, thank you for that. This might be the last question, just depending on how much time we spend on it. And it's for Banu, but also if other folks wanted to chime in, they definitely can. But some attendees are wondering if you can talk a little bit more about amnesia with respect to empire as either an intentional or passive process.
That's such a great question, and it's something I agonize over all the time, because I am someone who was trained in the sciences, so no one taught me any of the history that I'm reading now. And I grew up in India, and I still didn't know any of the ecological history that I'm reading now. And it's partly, it just makes me so angry when I read the history and sort of what has happened. And when I look at contemporary ecology and the kind of frameworks that we work with. And so I think we have to say as feminists, this is very intentional, right? So the minute one recognizes the ways, what caused the world that we create now, there is a reason to obfuscate it. There is a reason for, that this is not being taught in classes, and that it's our ignorance that, and the amnesia, both of fields and, contemporary work, that allows us to continue to pretend none of that happened in the past. And so I think, which is why feminist work is, and the work everyone's talking about is so important, is for us to historicize and understand where ideas came from and why we don't know certain things. Like this whole idea of agnotology, of, it's the science of ignorance. There is a politics behind why we don't know some things. And I think that's so important.
I have to concur in everything. I mean, this is what drives me actually, is these stories of what we don't know. And why don't we know them?
Yeah.
And what happened to create that? And that how that gets perpetuated. And it seems to be across the board. And it's not only gendered, it's also racialized. And this is this question of Black Lives Matters. We're not going to forget this. Sorry, we're not going away. This is not only ongoing, it goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And so, yeah, and this denial, I'd written down before we started, denial, silencing, erasure, amnesia.
Yeah, and then Natali's point is, and we know certain things that are just plain wrong, right? And we keep perpetuating those frameworks.
We keep saying it over and over.
Yeah, I think that this is in conversation with Banu about my work in a previous setting. It was like, oh, so what do you think we know about epigenetics? And it's like, what's new about it? And a lot of the things is that actually we've already known so much. We know already that social, cultural, political environments affect our health. We've known that. Indigenous metaphysics has also highlighted that. The ways in which certain things become popular and trending is also part of a different kind of force that is dominated within a neocolonial context. But the thing is, the other thing too, is that the solution is also that we already know something, which is that we already know who gets sick more often than not. It's poor people of color. We already know we don't need predictive medicine. We don't necessarily need a special silver bullet or biomarker to tell us whether or not one particular body would manifest gestational diabetes or type 2 diabetes. The thing is that the investment is so focused on speculating on future health that it takes away the resource and the attention from looking at what's at stake in the present. And that is really what I'm trying to make, that's the main point I make in the book, which is that how we mobilize knowledge, whether it's seen as new or old, is differentially maneuvered towards particular kinds of political stakes. So something very old can kind of reemerge as something pitched as new, but then the same underlying epistemic structures and ideologies persist. And I think that is the kind of like dynamic that needs extra attention, right? It's not necessarily old or new or what we forget or what we don't know, but how certain things remain durable as well.
And there, for me, with the radiation story, I mean, before, Alice Stewart was the person who sort of determined that the X-rays were causing the fetuses to, the child born who'd been exposed to radiation and as a fetus to double their chances of developing cancer. But we knew before that time that X-rays were dangerous. And if one X-ray can do that, that means radiation's dangerous. And we're still having this argument. Is it dangerous or not? Is low level, and we're talking 40, 50, 60 years as if we don't already know something. And it's this constant like amnesia, prove it, amnesia, prove it. And I think this is, or denial and prove it, denial and prove it. And I think this is part of a system that perpetuates this kind of violence against us because we're spending so much energy trying to prove something we already know. We don't need, like you're saying, we don't have to have thousands of studies to know that poor people and people of color are most impacted. We need to act on it. We need to do something about it. People are being harmed every day. Children are being harmed every day by this. But meantime, we're trying to argue it and prove it.
I also find that so frustrating, that it's like things that everybody knew 50 years ago, now nobody knows, it seems like. I mean, just even you were mentioning kind of the way that there was this existential anxiety about nuclear weapons destroying the planet, back in the 50s. And, it was just something that people were extremely concerned about all over the world, but especially in the United States and Russia and parts of Europe. Now, when you ask young people, what are they worried about? They're not worried about nuclear annihilation. They don't know. They seem, okay, I'm generalizing. Okay, I'm generalizing a lot. There's so many more things to be afraid of now. But it just seems like the knowledge of the precipice that we are still on. I mean, the nuclear clock, it used to be 12 minutes to midnight. Now it's what, like 30 seconds?
Right.
So it's terrifying to realize the kind of blissful ignorance, or not blissful, I shouldn't say blissful, the ignorance that we're in and how easily our minds get distracted from the things that really concern us to the things that would make us spend more, the things that would kind of fit with neoliberal goals about, getting us to spend more money on the things that will enrich the people who already have too much, right? Those are the things we're supposed to be excited about and care about and know about. And it's like the things that actually affect us and our lives those are the things that we quote unquote forget, or that we're deprived of knowledge about by whether it's the media, education. Yeah, it's very frustrating.
Very frustrating.
Right, so we are about at time. I know that several folks had questions about sharing slides, and I'm wondering if the panelists would be open to sending slides.
Yeah.
The recording will also be available on the Facebook, so you can also come back and view the slides at any point there. And then I also just wanted to highlight the additional work that the grad students have put together. So this is our first of 4 panels. We have our second one this afternoon at 3 p.m. and the topic is Technology as Political Resistance. And then next month, August 27th at 10 a.m., we have Pedagogies of Resistance, Sharing Knowledge as a Political Act. And September 3rd at 11 a.m., we have Archiving for Feminist Futures, Ensuring Feminism and Resistance Stay Alive. And we also had just a general thank you to our graduate student organizers. They were pivotal in conceptualizing the original event and then also just recreating this into webinars and putting time during their summer at making this happen. So thank you to all of them. It's a team from across disciplines, across universities that were just really excellent. So if anybody has any lingering questions, I'll stay on in the chat and you can put them there. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to the speakers and have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much. Thanks for organizing this. Thanks to all the panelists.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Stacy.
Thanks, Stacy.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Stacy. I'm going to stay on too in case people have questions. I haven't been able to look at the chat, at the Q&A or the chat very much because I've been focusing. So until you close it off, I'll stay on for a few more minutes.
Great. Amy, do you want to share your email with Sinead?
Oh, yes. I think. Somebody wanted me to address the relationship between ecofeminisms and eco-womanisms, but I don't know if that person is even still there.
I can look really quick. Hold on just a second.
Should I?
Actually, no, that was Sinead, yeah. Oh, but has to run.
Okay.
But perhaps that's something that can be posited over email.
Okay. Great.
Great. I think we're all set. There's just 19 attendees that are slowly dropping off. But thank you so much for joining us.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Have a great day.
See you soon.